So Russia just confirmed that North Korean troops were fighting in Kursk, which I would argue marks the most significant escalation we've seen so far in this war. I mean, this is the kind of thing that opens the door to a broader regional or even global war. And there have been people since this information first started to come out saying it's all fake. It's just completely made up Ukrainian, US, NATO propaganda. Or when they finally see some of the evidence that we'll run through here in a moment, they say it's not that big of a deal. Don't make anything out of this. Who cares? It is a big deal. Again, this is kind of a tipping point in this conflict where we have uniformed military personnel from another nation taking part in the hostilities. That's significant, no matter how you cut it. Now, diving into what we know so far, this was all around a statement made by President Putin earlier today, celebrating what he refers to as the liberation of Kursk, or finally pushing all of the Ukrainian forces out of Kursk, Russia. This happened in the last couple days when Gomal fell. We have some video here showing Russian forces raising the flag in that small settlement on the Russian side of the Russian-Ukrainian border in Kursk. It looks like this is the last somewhat populated center to have been cleared of Ukrainian forces. It's possible right now, and I'll pull up a map here to kind of show this area. It's possible Ukraine still has some troops in the wood lines there in Russian territory, but nonetheless, with Gomal falling, it's the last population center for Russia to retake. And in celebrating that, we had a statement from Valery Gerasimov, the Russian chief of staff, who said, quote, "Soldiers and officers of the Korean People's Army performing combat missions shoulder to shoulder with Russian servicemen demonstrated high professionalism during the repelling of the Ukraine invasion, demonstrated fortitude, courage, and heroism in battle." Now, this has been a lot to take in recent months. First, this came out, I want to say last fall. We started to hear these rumors that North Korean troops might be on their way to Ukraine, and we've generally kind of heard things like that for a while. So I would say right out the gate, and I treated it with a lot of skepticism, saying like, great, anybody can say anything. We'll see how this materializes. But then we started to see some videos of training, and it's like, okay, maybe. I mean, it's a bit of a stretch. And look, there's a lot of people in northeastern Russia, especially, that would look a lot at a distance, especially would look like possibly North Korean. So you can't just go off of a video of people training. But then we started to get accounts from Russian soldiers talking about, what the training process was like. Guys talking about the difficulties and the challenges of actually training these North Korean soldiers. So, okay, we're moving a little bit more towards this is probably pretty accurate in some degree. And about that time, we started to discuss how exactly are they going to be used. And my personal assessment, which was proven to be wrong, was that they would probably be used in kind of a rear guard capacity, maybe manning some sort of artillery systems, but no chance they'd be pushed forward in any sort of assault where they could possibly be captured. I was clearly mistaken, because then we started to get videos, some pretty wild videos, of what, again, looked like North Korean troops getting hit by drones. And it wasn't just these, quick clips on drone footage, but we started to see some assaults that Ukraine said, hey, these are North Korean troops in the assault. And again, it's kind of a video at a distance. You can't really take that much. You clearly can't tell individual characteristics of these people, but the tactics and techniques they were using were very unique. You just weren't seeing this kind of, dismounted maneuver across open terrain without any sort of vehicle support being carried out by Russia. Or when Russia does it, they tended to move in small groups, squad-size elements, and kind of probe for fire, if you will. But these, you can see in this video, you've got probably a company plus size element just wandering across open terrain, getting decimated by Ukrainian artillery and drones. That was weird, to all of a sudden see a new tactic popping up. And then all of a sudden, we've got actual North Korean soldiers that were captured. What do you know? So this kind of put the nail in the coffin for anybody that was still, and for what it's worth, even after this came out, there were still people saying it's completely made up. But Ukraine had to go to South Korea to get some interpreters to come down because nobody could understand what these guys were saying. And they explained exactly their process of coming from North Korea down to fighting with Russia. So, pretty clear cut at that point, and no longer a rumor. But we've actually got a little more detail now coming from the Russian side. You got these reporters now saying, the secret's out. We can tell you guys. In reality, the majority of us knew that this had been going on for quite a while. They weren't fooling anybody. Well, they were fooling some people, unfortunately. There were some wild trolls online that just would not believe that North Korean troops would actually be in Russia. See if they buy it now. Anyways, Alexander Kotz, a Russian mill blogger, put this together, kind of running through this whole process. He said at first they were trained at training grounds, familiarized themselves with modern combat tactics, acquired drone control skills, and became familiar with field realities. Then the combat buryats, as our military jokingly and for the sake of secrecy called them, were transferred to the Kursk region. They lived in field conditions so as to not show off. At first they held the third line, then the second, and then they were tested in fortifications and finally the assaults. So a little bit of validation for me here, saying that they were tested in the third lines first. I personally thought that they would be used in some sort, maybe it was building fortifications in the rear, but in Kursk, like Russia wasn't really expecting Ukraine to continue pushing. So maybe they'd be moved down into other areas, maybe Belgorod, kind of building up some defenses there. The artillery made sense to me because we started to see a lot of North Korean artillery systems arrive in Russia, so they might be able to utilize those same systems, same munitions, and there's not necessarily the need for direct and immediate deconfliction. You could have one Russian interpreter with a North Korean artillery unit kind of calling out coordinates, and you don't have to have the constant back and forth like you would in some sort of assault formation, which clearly they got into. He says the Korean soldiers distinguished themselves with their coherence, discipline, fatal disregard for death, and remarkable endurance. It is understandable. They're mostly young guys, strong, pumped up, and well-trained in their homeland. Fatal disregard for death. That's actually something similar that we'd hear from the Ukrainian forces saying that they were facing these guys. They weren't brushing them aside. They were, and this is something that there's always been a big disconnect between Westerners, I'll say, just anybody outside of the conflict zone, and the actual Ukrainian soldiers there on the front. The Ukrainian soldiers do not like any of these people, but there is I think it's safe to say there's a healthy level of respect. I mean, especially when we're talking about some of the Wagner group fighters in and around Bakhmut. When you hear Ukrainian soldiers talk about them, they hate them, understandably so, but it doesn't do any good to just pretend like they're complete bumbling idiots moving forward. These groups at times, and put together in the right way, can be incredibly lethal formations, and a lot of what I was hearing about the North Koreans is they just keep coming. Like, even beyond the point where the Russian forces would stop and try to dig in or turn around, the North Koreans keep advancing into the fire. Kotz says they had a strict rule not to be captured alive and to not surrender voluntarily. I actually don't know the story of how these two North Koreans were eventually captured. They look like they were wounded, so maybe wounded in assault, maybe they were knocked unconscious or something like that, right? Couldn't take their own life before they were picked up, but clearly a couple of them were detained. He says, by the way, the enemy tried to persuade them not to do this by throwing around imitation DPRK banknotes. And we got a picture of one here that I'll put up on the screen with the following text: surrender. Kim Jong-un has brought you to death and starved your families. Place a yellow flag in front of you, raise your hands and shout loudly, freedom. Walk slowly towards the Ukrainian soldiers and fulfilled their demands. Again, not clear that this was ever effective. Definitely got in the heads of some. You can't not think about that when you got pamphlets like this and the information operations affecting someone in the middle of a fight for their life in the front. But there's no indications that anybody actually turned because of this. Again, we don't know the full story of the two, but they were pretty significantly wounded. He says it was important for Pyongyang, talking about why they were doing this. It was important for Pyongyang, North Korea, to gain experience in modern combat operations, to study the tactics and technologies of an enemy, the collective West, and to acquire knowledge that was inaccessible due to the sanctions regime. As these tasks were accomplished, but the Koreans also made a significant contribution to the defeat of the Ukrainian group on our soil. In fact, he kind of talks to how the North Koreans were used here, answering some questions, if we can take this at face value. He says their arrival allowed us to not ease the pressure on the other sections of the front to continue the offensive in the Donbass. And that was one of the arguments as to why this Kursk operation kicked off in the first place, was to try to alleviate pressure of Ukrainian forces elsewhere along the front, especially in the Donbass. So, maybe Kotz is just reading Ukrainian assessments there, but nonetheless, that does line up with what some Ukrainian leadership has talked about in terms of the rationale for the Kursk offensive in the first place. Now, I do want to get into, of course, what this actually means going forward, because I do, the personal assessment here is that this really does open the door to some sort of larger escalation down the road. And what I mean by that is there's all of these different steps that are played in the escalation game, and I think it's safe to argue that at this point, they've been managed effectively. The fact that the fighting still today is only happening inside of Ukraine and to a degree inside of Russia, I think is a testament to the escalation management of this conflict. Whether you think other aspects have been good or bad, the fact that this hasn't spilled into other NATO countries, there is an argument there to say that the escalation has been managed well. The first big argument there was with weapons. And you heard this, we're hearing this less and less for what it's worth now, but this was the argument against sending, you remember the United States, it was only defensive weapons, then fine, okay, we'll send offensive weapons. We wouldn't send tanks, we wouldn't send Bradleys, we wouldn't send ATACMs, we wouldn't send long-range fires, we wouldn't send, still won't, the United States at least, won't send F-16s. All of these, for the most part, are trying to manage that escalation flow with Russia. And you can see a lot of White House officials worried about that. What happens if Western munitions start striking Moscow? What does that do for the escalation ladder? We kind of got around that with the weapons. We worked our way through it. Okay, so there are NATO weapons being used every single day in this war to kill Russian soldiers, which a few years ago would have been seen as like, oh my God, that thing is going, that singular event could lead to World War III. But we managed it in the sense that we're also seeing Iranian and North Korean weapons used at scale by Russia, especially the Iranian Shahed-style drones are being used to kill Ukraine and have killed a lot of Ukrainian civilians. So it almost seems like we found a level playing field there in a sense where both sides say, fine, we're not going to get too upset about that thing. You don't get too upset about this. We'll call it even on the weapons front. This is different. This is uniformed military personnel. These are not volunteers coming from North Korea. This is a North Korean military personnel coming from that country directly to fight against Ukraine in this conflict. Now, there's a little caveat here that this was all taking place in Kursk, which is inside of Russian territory, which is a smart move by Russia because they can say, hey, who cares? This is our territory. Who can tell us what countries we can have into our own country to defend our citizens? And they've got a valid point. There's not a lot of pushback to be had there, but think about what this could mean for the rest of the conflict. First off, this opens the door, and there's ongoing conversations right now inside of Russian media talking about this. What's next? And look, Russia is claiming these annexed territories from Crimea, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk as legally Russian. It's been a point in these negotiations that we've heard from senior Russian officials. They're not pretending with that. Whether they actually believe it maybe is a different story, but they're saying it for sure. They're saying that is legally Russian territory. Well, if it's Russian territory, then what's the big deal of North Korean troops doing the fighting in Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye? But here's the thing. That's where the fighting is happening because Russia hasn't taken all of those oblasts quite yet. So the line in Zaporozhye, you have Ukrainian forces on one side and Russian forces on the other. Under this argument that North Korean troops operating inside of Russia, no big deal, they could just as quickly be moved into some of those occupied territories, and they all of a sudden are at the very front. That is the front in this war. Under that rationale, they could be there. I mean, technically right now, essentially all of the East and the South is in quote, Russian territory because Russia has claimed ownership of it. So something to think about there. But also, how is that any different? Put the shoe on the other foot here. How is that any different? Even just sticking with Kursk for a second, okay? How is that any different? North Korean troops fighting for Russia in Kursk to push out Ukrainian soldiers. How is that any different from a coalition of the willing, let's call it Polish, British, and German or French troops, fighting inside of Ukraine to expel Russian forces from internationally recognized Ukrainian territory? How is it different? Like, where is the difference there? And this is where I'm saying it seems like we've just opened up a new step on the escalation ladder that was there when North Korea started doing this in the first place, but similar to the Russian little green men back in 2014, where it's just enough confusion to where the world didn't exactly know how to respond towards Russia because, they look Russian, they sound Russian, they seem to be taking their orders from Russia, but they don't have that Russian flag on their shoulder, so maybe let's not overreact. That's kind of been the mindset for the last couple months, but now it's been clarified. North Korean troops are actively participating in this conflict. What can Russia say now? If British troops, to say we get British Royal Marines down in Kherson manning the lines, pushing back Russian forces from internationally recognized Ukrainian territory. Isn't that the same? So again, kind of in that light, this feels like one of those times, and we haven't had very many of these in this conflict, where it's setting the stage to be this situation that we look back on in years maybe and say that is where the war changed. It was regional. It was local, technically, just between Russia and Ukraine along the border that they shared. Now we have another nation sending their troops, their government deploying their troops to the war zone, actively taking part in hostilities. It feels like we're on a slippery slope right now where what North Korea just did in Kursk can be justified in a lot of ways that would lead to multiple nations entering the conflict. So we'll keep an eye on it and see how this all shakes out. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.